Hello, everyone. I hope you are enjoying the Growth Mentor Summit. My name is Austin Mullins, and I'm very happy to be here to share some insights with you on scalable content marketing, how you can maintain quality and consistency in your content marketing efforts while publishing more. So today's presentation is going to be all about how you can increase that publishing volume, but make sure that nothing falls to the wayside and that you're still producing content that is highly effective and meets any sort of brand standards you're looking to enforce. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. First off, I think it's important to tell you a bit about myself. Who am I? Why should you trust me to speak on this topic? I am the founder of Conversion Creatives, a content marketing and SEO agency. I'm, of course, a vetted growth mentor, being that I'm presenting here at the Growth Mentor Summit. I'm also a copy blogger certified content marketer and have been for several years. I'm the director of training at BAMF Media, where we're working on launching some great new trainings as we come into the new year. I also previously held a position as a sales leader at a startup and have been a conversion copywriter in the past. And a bit of a fun fact about me, I've taken exactly one decent photo of myself in a suit jacket 3 years ago, and I have continued to use it for absolutely everything ever since. So if you find me on social media just about anywhere, that's probably the photo that you will be seeing if you happen to look me up. So who is this talk for? This talk definitely is not for everyone. It's a bit of an advanced topic. First off, if you're going to get anything out of this talk, it's very important that you've already bought into the idea of content marketing being a growth channel for your business. We aren't going to be covering anything about why you should be producing content. I'm not going to explain basic terminology. If you're not convinced that content marketing is for you, this talk isn't either. Not to be harsh, there will be another one, I'm sure within the hour, that you might want to tune into, but this is only for people that know that content marketing is a growth channel for their business and want to know how they can start to scale that without compromising on quality. It's also important that you're not new to producing content. So again, this is about how to scale your efforts. If you're just getting started, this sort of process is going to be overkill to the max. So just don't worry about it. You can come back to it later on and watch the replay. And then the third thing that's really important is if you're going to watch this and you're going to get anything out of it, your plans for the future should include building a content team, refining your content team, or working with an agency. I'm going to be focusing on how you can use process to improve your content team's effectiveness. So if one person produces all your content and you're not building a team, a lot of that's going to be unnecessary. So this is very much focused on content teams and how they can be productive and produce great work. So let's talk about the key principles of how to produce consistently fantastic content. The first is you need to have clearly documented standards. Every single process that makes up a piece of the overall journey that your content goes through, from idea all the way through published and promoted and successful piece, and even coming back and revisiting that later. All of that needs to have very clear documentation for the individual team members to reference as they do their work. You also need to have clear roles and responsibilities. There can be no debate about who is responsible for a particular step in the process. You don't want people thinking that, oh, this editor was supposed to do this or this writer was supposed to do this. It needs to be very clearly delineated who is responsible for what. In a very related note, it's also important that the team has a lot of transparency. At the very least, editors and managers need to know who is working on what so that they can identify and fix bottlenecks, because often an editor is waiting on a writer to finish something before they can have another look at it or something like that. Maybe the graphic designer is waiting on the content to be far enough along for them to produce a graphic that's relevant. So there are a lot of interdependencies in a content team, and it's very important that people can see where their counterparts are at with their tasks. And then, of course, we need accountability for each stage. I feel that the only real way to keep content quality really high is to make sure that editorial review and feedback are standard at every single stage of content's creation. So that means your writers can't be married to their first drafts. Everyone on the team has to be very comfortable receiving and giving feedback for the team to be truly effective. So as we go through all this, just keep these core principles in mind, that these are kind of our guiding standards in what we want to instill in a content team to help make this whole process work. So as you start to think about systematizing your content production process, there are two foundational documents that are going to be really important for you to start to build out. The first is an overview of your editorial process. So because you're going to be building a robust process and you require all these people in different roles to play a part in that, they need to understand how their role fits into the overall machine that's going to be producing this content. So not only do you need to develop this process, but you need to have kind of a primer on that process that everyone on the team, or even a guest writer who might be, producing content for your company on a limited basis, all of them need to be able to read this and understand what goes into taking a content piece from idea to finished product and who all is involved to make that happen. A great example of this is the editorial process that Smashing Magazine has published, and you can see the link there in the slide. Highly recommend you go and check that out. They put a lot of energy into having a concise but well done editorial process that includes what sort of content they're looking for, what they'll approve, what sort of tone they take, all those sorts of things. The second important document is a style guide. So beyond the high level of how content gets produced and what the various phases are, people also need to understand how your brand communicates with its customers, what sort of voice and tone to take, what sort of terminology you want to embrace or avoid as you try to have a unique voice in the marketplace. A great example of this is within Uber's brand guidelines. They have an overview on the tone of voice, and they get really specific. So I'll try to include that link somewhere down in the comments below, and hopefully you can find that. But highly recommend checking that out as well as an example of what does it mean to actually inform tone and voice as you start to build out a style guide. And we'll revisit this in just a couple slides, and I'll mention some other resources as well. And why do we need this? This is a quote from Liam. He's the founder of Inkwell Content. He's also the former editor of consulting.com. And I was asking him about this, and asking several peers who are experts in the space about, what do you think about editorial process? What makes a great one? And he mentioned that so often when I ask a client for a style guide, they either shrug their shoulders or they send me a document meant for designers, not writers. And this really is a common problem. So many people haven't put together this documentation, and when they go to work with, a content marketing firm that maybe doesn't produce these sorts of foundational documents, or they go to say have a guest post written or just work with a freelance writer, they aren't providing any real guidance. And then it's no surprise that they often are not happy with the end result because they weren't able to provide the needed documentation to set that writer or that content agency up for success. So this is very much something to keep in mind, is that producing this is an investment in your content's quality and consistency over time, no matter what route you take to produce that, whether it's an in-house team or you're working with freelancers, what have you. So let's talk about a little bit more about how to create that style or brand voice guide. In order for you to write, or for anyone, outside of maybe, a founder to write in a way that feels on brand, they need to have a guide that is able to fill in some of the gaps in their existing knowledge of how that brand should speak. So when you're putting this together, a few things that you want to include are samples of on-brand writing. Again, this often is something that a founder has produced, and that will just naturally give someone a way to kind of read through and start to almost subconsciously absorb that brand's ideal voice. Of course, you want to give guidelines on voice and tone. Again, this can come down to reading level, word choice, even the type of tenses you're using, things like that. How you use your brand. Do you use your brand as a verb or only as a noun? All these sorts of finer points on how your brand speaks so that it can be consistent across different writers. You also want to include information on your key customer audiences, your target audiences, and what their assumed level of sophistication is. So there's a very big difference between writing to, say, a broad consumer audience for a CPG brand that may not have a deep knowledge of whatever particular product line that you're selling, versus writing for, say, an information security firm where they're targeting highly technical executives that can use a lot of jargon, and it's very comfortable. So you want to indicate where your audience is at and how much your writers should assume that they know versus educating on more basic matters of your industry, your product, what have you. And then you also want to include, where applicable, a glossary of industry terms. As you bring in different writers, it's very possible that many of them are not subject matter experts, but in fact, a lot of writers are really good at research. But you can give them a leg up by giving them a glossary of industry terms. And that also ensures that there won't be any confusion where maybe you disagree on kind of the finer points of a definition of a particular term versus what competition may say. And this gives you a point to clarify that and make sure that they're speaking from the same perspective across your brand. And as you're working on putting this together, I know a lot of people struggle with brand voice and how to put together these voice and tone guidelines. So I highly recommend picking up a copy of the book, What They Hear When You Write, written by a wonderful copywriter named Abby Woodcock. You can get it on Amazon, and I believe it's like 60 or 80 pages long, so you will be able to get through it pretty quickly. I think it'll give you a lot of clarity around what the different potential routes are in terms of the tone you take when you speak to your ideal audience. Now that we've covered voice and tone, I want to talk about what goes into the content production process and how you can start to systematize that, what sorts of things you should be thinking about at each stage. And to do this, I'm going to give you an example of the editorial process that we use at my agency, Conversion Creatives. This is the same process that we use both internally, but then also for our clients. Pretty much all of them go through these stages. And so it should be broadly applicable across a lot of different niches, a lot of different business types. So the stages in order are: 1, you start with content ideation. 2, it goes into research and outlining as you kind of start to flesh out that idea. Then we have drafting, adding rich media, the final review, and then publishing. And many people stop there, but to be truly effective, you've got to keep going with promotion, and then measuring impact and ROI, and then occasionally doing extra revisions and republishing and re-promoting this content after it's been updated to better perform and better suit what your audience is really looking for. So we are going to walk through each stage of this process in this presentation, but of course there's more info that I can't possibly fit into a presentation like this. So if you want to read more about what goes into each of these stages, or you just want to have a reference for this material later on as you go to build your own editorial process, I highly recommend you go pick up our free guide on how to build an effective editorial process at conversioncreatives.com/editorial-process. That'll be available. I'm not planning on taking that down anytime soon, but of course that link has only been shared here to date, so you can be among the first to have a look at this information. Highly recommend you go ahead and download that now. So without further ado, let's jump into the very first stage of a content creation process and editorial process, and that is content ideation. Where should you source your ideas from? Typically, again, whether it's internal, whether it's working for clients, our topics and our content ideas typically come from 3 different sources. The first is the classic, the foundation of any good organic content marketing strategy. It's competitive keyword research. We take a list of our top competitors within a given niche and look at, what are they producing that's actually working? What is working from a link building perspective? What is driving people further down that funnel as they start to consider different options? And then what is ultimately leading to the purchasing behavior, the lead generation behavior that you want at the end of the day? We also take a look at direct audience feedback. So this can come in a couple different forms. The most common ones being if you have an existing audience, especially if you have a nice email list, you can poll your existing audience directly and just ask them, which of these topics would you be interested in hearing more from us on? And often that'll give you a good idea of what sort of direction the audience wants you to go in. And then another option, especially if you haven't built that audience, is to lurk in the communities where your ideal customers hang out and see what sort of questions they ask, what sort of conversations they're having amongst themselves. And that can be an excellent source of content ideas. Some of the best places to go for that are Quora, Reddit, and then of course niche forums that are kind of industry specific, as well as private Facebook groups. And another real gold mine that many people ignore are paid private trainings for your target audience, where they've already built not only an audience that's in that industry, but an audience that is investing in themselves and their business. Those can often be even better people to research because they are making that investment already and are more likely to take action on some sort of content you produce. And the third place we look for content ideas is actually doing a SERP analysis. And so what I mean by this is that, yes, you can do your keyword research and assume the intent of most searches just based on what the keywords are. But occasionally, if you look deeper at the actual search results, so you actually punch in those keywords, search it on Google, and see what is ranking, sometimes there's different intent revealed there than the keywords themselves would indicate. A good example here are I've seen queries where people were searching for a best product and getting a lot of like top 10 listicles, but the ones that were ranking number one would be the best X product for the money, showing that the intent was actually a value intent rather than just the best of the best available intent, which is interesting in a market that might have wide price variance, and it gives you an idea of what the majority of people are actually looking for, because that result is doing so well. So very interesting to kind of combine number one, your competitive keyword research, with a bit of number three, looking and actually analyzing the search engine results to see if the intent is face valid or if the results are telling you that the intent is actually something else beyond just what the keyword would imply. And this here is a quote from Ryan Robinson, a popular blogger. I was asking him about where he gets his best content ideas, and he said, I like to ask them directly. So he's already built a pretty healthy audience, whether through surveys, dropping out questions on Twitter, or asking my readers to leave a comment. That's how I tend to generate the most successful content ideas. So again, that just lends more weight to the idea that once you've built an audience, being able to ask them directly what sorts of things they're interested in covering is an excellent source of content ideas. The next stage is your research and outlining. So within that, there are kind of several sub-steps. Typically, the first step is to do your information gathering. So before a writer can take an idea and turn it into a true, an outline even, they need to have all the needed information. So this could mean just reading through competitor articles and seeing, to what depth people have covered different things. But if you really want your content to be strong, the best things you can do are either interview a subject matter expert. Oftentimes that'll be someone within your company, maybe that isn't a writer, or if you're doing client work, maybe it's someone within your client's company that can really speak with authority on a particular topic, but maybe is not the person who could turn that into a great article or other piece of content. And then another fantastic thing you can do is conduct original research as you do this information gathering. So if you have the means to actually poll a significant audience of a particular subset and produce original research, that's often going to lead to insights that no one else has, which means your content is going to be interesting just by virtue of that. You've collected information that no one else has. And so you are unique, and it's also going to help later on in your content promotion efforts because it's very easy comparatively to get links to original research versus something that's rehashed and has already been kind of covered a million times. Once that information gathering is done, the next phase is to actually produce that outline. So whether you've had someone just dedicated to research doing the research, or you had whoever is going to be writing your outlines and drafts do that research, the next stage is to turn that into an outline. So set up the structure of how you want the content to flow, how it's going to drive towards a relevant business outcome, and what sort of key points you're going to hit on throughout that content. And then once that outline is done, again, we like to keep editorial feedback a part of every single stage. So even though it's not a draft yet, go ahead and have whoever is editing the content take a look at it and see, A, does it fit the brand? Does it touch on all the key elements that need to be touched on to cover this topic effectively? Is it structured in a way that makes sense and is easy to read? And is there promotion potential here? Does it make sense that the way this topic is covered and the selection of the topic itself, is this promotable? And is it likely to actually have an audience that's of a decent size? So it's not at all uncommon that the feedback from the editor at this point would lead to additional sections, reordering it and changing the structure of the article, or even realizing that there's a content upgrade that is going to help you drive leads off this content, or perhaps a promotional angle that hadn't been thought of yet. So very important to go ahead and keep that feedback loop throughout this process. Once that outline is done, it's time to move on to drafting. So obviously, turn it into a full-fledged rough draft. Honestly, the best writers will go ahead and strive to have this be something that could be published. So even though they know that editorial feedback is coming, you want to instruct your writers to go ahead and try to produce something that you could hit publish on that day and it would do well. That is the idea and what they should be aiming for. And yet still, we want to have that editor involved so we can make it even better than one person could possibly make it. So once that draft is done, they'll pass it to an editor. Again, they're going to provide feedback on any needed changes to the substance, the structure, the voice, the flow of the content. And then, of course, typically there will be feedback at each stage. So we'll then go into revisions and then a final draft based on those revisions, basically just implementing those edits. And then there are also a number of kind of finer points to check at this stage. We actually have a full checklist. It's included in that guide I mentioned earlier. So I'll throw the link in later in this presentation again, and I'll also try to include it below. But highly recommend you take a look at that so you can see the checklist. It's just too lengthy to put on a slide, but there are a lot of kind of finer points of formatting and making sure things are ready to go before you upload it to your website. And then now that the content is effectively done from a written perspective, the next stage is to add rich media. So your images, your video, whatever is going to support it. Maybe it's a small infographic. So typically you're having a graphics team or a graphic designer as a freelancer produce this. And then it needs to be checked by whoever's the lead to, whether that's the editor or someone who's overseeing this whole process to make sure it meets the following standards. First off, the quality needs to be high, but not to the extent that it's going to hurt your load time. So specific to images, you either need to make sure that that image is being served in different resolutions based on the screen size, or kind of come to a happy medium that's not so high res it's going to make your page really heavy and hurt you from a technical SEO perspective. Obviously, if it's an asset that's meant to support some text content, you don't want it to distract too much from that text content. So is it appropriate in how it's supporting the body text versus distracting away from it? And so that's kind of a finer point to just think about the role this rich media is meant to play. Is it appropriate for the content and the viewers? Is it on brand? If it's externally sourced media, is it used with permission? So have you actually secured that permission in writing is actually very important in case there were to be any issues there. Make sure it doesn't violate copyright. Obviously, there are Creative Commons licenses, and so not all external media needs to be actually sourced, direct permission. But make sure that you verified that, because it can come back on you, and it's just a hassle you don't want to have to deal with. And then when possible, if you're using externally sourced media, have it be self-hosted. So if it's an image you grabbed from Unsplash or something, make sure that you're re-uploading that on your own site rather than uploading it via a link, because you don't want that link to break if that site moves that asset. And then, is the media responsive? Is it able to change size with the page? And has it been appropriately marked up with metadata? So, for instance, do you have your image alt tags, which are increasingly important as accessibility is becoming more and more of a hot topic? Not that it ever was not important, but now more than ever, you want to make sure you're addressing that on each piece of content you produce. And then once all that is ready, before content is published on your website or sent to a client, it needs to undergo one final review, just to make sure nothing is missing, nothing has gotten lost throughout any of this process. It's good to have someone look it over one more time as a completed product, preferably on a day where they haven't already provided feedback on that piece of content in some other stage. It's really good for people to come at it with fresh eyes. And then finally, as you're publishing, as you're uploading it to your content management system and you prepare to take it live, you want to make sure that it meets standards for trust. So, is this something that's actually going to boost your brand's reputation? As a result of reading this, are your customers going to trust you more rather than less? Just think high level and make sure that there's nothing in the way the content is written or the visuals, what have you, that is going to damage that reputation. You want each piece of content to build on that reputation. In terms of links, is there any internal linking that needs to be done? So have you talked about other topics that are relevant, but you've expounded on them in a separate article and it makes sense to do that internal linking? Think about that. That's a good way to not only pass link juice around your site, but also to make sure that anyone who is interested in a particular topic knows that you've actually produced content around that. And it'll drive time on site and also help people to respect your company more as an authority. Is it ready for shareability and engagement? So do you have your sharing buttons and calls to action? Are they working? Are your open graph settings formatted correctly so that when people, for instance, share on Facebook or Twitter, that it pulls in an image rather than having that dumb gray box that people have when they don't set their open graph settings correctly? Is the timing correct? So is it being published at a time where your audience is awake? And also, is it a time when they're likely to actually read it? So make sure you're not close to any major holidays. Make sure you're aware enough of big news events that you would know if, say some major tragedy had happened and no one cares about your article that day. Sometimes it's important to make last minute timing adjustments based on what's happening in the world and how likely you are to be able to get someone's attention. And then, of course, make sure your technical, your metadata, your SEO considerations are addressed. And then finally, edit and test for accessibility. So again, make sure those alt tags are there, make sure it's responsive, make sure that different sizes of devices and different internet browsers can access your content You don't want to unnecessarily limit your audience. And then with your content live, it's time to start thinking about content promotion. So there are several distinct phases within content promotion. The first is you want to do some pre-launch marketing. It can be great to go ahead and hint at content that is coming out soon via your social accounts. If you've interviewed any experts that are outside your company for this, it's great to go ahead and talk to them about when you plan to publish it. Try to get them on board with sharing it and linking to it before you even publish it. Immediately upon publishing, obviously you want to do social sharing across all your owned social media, do email promotion across whatever email list you've built. And then the final piece to make sure you're getting long-term organic benefit is to do some link building outreach whenever possible around it. So whenever it would make sense for someone else to link to it in a contextually relevant way, and you can do that outreach without it being forced or it seeming just totally inappropriate, you want to always be doing link building outreach, building your site's link profile, because that is the number one correlated factor with long-term organic growth. So it's very important that you do that. And it's very important that you promote your content at all. So many people make the mistake of not promoting their content effectively and then wonder why, despite publishing and despite spending a ton of money producing content, they don't see results. It's often because the promotion is either not there at all or it's just not up to par. And then having promoted this, you want to actually measure your impact and your return on investment. So any piece of content you're producing should be designed to drive a particular result. Maybe that's growing your email list. Maybe it's producing qualified leads. Maybe it's driving like e-commerce purchase activity. Maybe it's a retention play even, and this is content you've produced to try to lower churn and address a common customer issue. Whatever it is, you want to find a way of tracking that. And typically, if you can, you want to set up conversion goals in Google Analytics or some similar tool so that you can actually have hard numbers on how well your content is performing against whatever that key performance indicator is. And a pro tip, go ahead and add a reminder or an entry in your project management software to review the performance of this content a few months later. See if any tweaks need to be made or if you're able to re-promote it later on so that you can, again, just increase that ROI, increase that impact, and make sure that your content is going as far as it can and doing as much as it possibly can for your business. So now that we've talked about what all the phases should be and what goes into all of those phases, how do you manage a process like this with so many different kind of sub-processes and things that need to be tended to and make sure that the ball doesn't get dropped? There are several things to keep in mind here. One is, again, you need to have clearly defined roles. People need to know what parts of this process they're responsible for, and there cannot be any debate about that. It's very important that people know which part they have to play here and when they can hand off a piece of content to someone else, expecting them to be accountable for their part. You need to have deadlines, but those deadlines should have padding. So you need to have deadlines at each stage of this. So people need to know when an outline is due, when a draft is due, when edits on that draft are due. Because a content marketing team has so many interdependencies, they need to know when they can expect to receive, an unfinished piece of content back to finish their piece, or when they are expected to pass that piece along to the next person. Similarly, that process of passing that work along needs to be streamlined. So you need to have only one medium in which that work gets passed back and forth. So if it's email, that's fine. If it's Slack, I don't think that's a great idea, but you can try it. If it's a project management software, that works great. As long as they're able to assign that to someone via a consistent process. And it's also important that the person who is receiving that acknowledges that they have received it, so that the person who's passing that work along can know that it has been passed along successfully, and they can move on to the next thing that they're responsible for. And then finally, you need some level of tracking how far along someone is with the task. So whether this is self-reported statuses or they're doing the work in a tool where you can actually see how far along it is as a manager, either way, you need some level of insight into how long it's taking someone and what they're working on specifically. And this is not to be micromanaging, but it's more so to see where bottlenecks might be or where someone might not fully understand the process, because the end result of this process should be that producing high quality content actually gets faster. Even though there are a lot of steps to run through, it should be so clear what needs to be done at each step that people don't have to spend as much time kind of wondering or thinking about what else needs to be done to get something ready to publish or to get it promoted, what have you. A few of my recommended tools for this. One that we love to use internally for this is Pipefy. It's kind of process-driven project management software. And I actually had a screenshot of it on the previous slide. This over here to the right is a screenshot from one of the phases of one of our Pipefy pipes. And what it actually allows us to do is to set specific fields that have to be filled in before a task can move to the next stage. And then also have due dates, assignees, all those sorts of things. And even checklists within there that people have to go through before they can move a particular piece of content from one stage to the next. So once you get this process built out, I highly recommend using a tool like Pipefy. Process Street is a very similar software that's also very popular. But either of those very process-driven softwares that can help you really have this process streamlined and set the right level of freedom and bounds to make sure that content is being produced very efficiently. Similarly, I've seen many teams use Asana very effectively for a similar thing where they're able to assign tasks across the team as content moves through various stages. And I believe they also have templates built within that you can start to build out what the various phases should be. And then the third tool, the one I actually recommend you start with until you get a pretty good idea of what your editorial process is going to be, is Google Sheets or Excel if you're more of a Microsoft person. But start to just keep track of some of this stuff, even before you make it as rigid as having, a streamlined project management system for all of this stuff. Just start to have people, with conditional logic, have drop downs for what stage something is at, and try to figure out where the real bottlenecks are in your process and start to fix those. And then once you have it running pretty well, that's when you can create it into a more robust process in one of these other tools, and allow your team to run through that, and should see some productivity gains from that at that point. So I know this can be overwhelming. As I mentioned, there's a lot to this. The truth is that creating a robust editorial process isn't something you can do overnight. It's going to take time and it's going to take iteration. There's going to be mistakes along the way. That's perfectly fine. At the end of the day, it's something that's well worth the effort once it's done. So I highly recommend that you actually start with the pieces of your content creation process that you or your team struggle with the most. That's going to help in one of two ways. Either it's going to just make it easier because the steps are so well documented of what needs to be done to actually get a particular part of the content produced. Or you might find that you want to outsource that portion, and it makes it far easier to outsource and actually have good results if you have a well-documented process for how you want that work done. So I highly recommend starting with whatever you're struggling with it, actually getting content to the level you want out the door and promoted so that people are actually reading it. And of course, don't forget you can get access to that free ebook on how to create an editorial process to kind of give you a leg up as you're putting this together at conversioncreatives.com/editorial-process. And that's all I've got today. So if you need any help with, actually putting together an editorial process, with deciding what content you need to produce to grow your business, anything around content marketing or SEO, you can always schedule a free Growth Mentor session with me. Just search me on the Growth Mentor platform. My name is Austin Mullins, and you'll find that nice blue request a call button. And you can go ahead and request that, and I'll be more than happy to help you out. Again, you can download that free guide, or feel free to email me directly at austin@conversioncreatives.com, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. So that's all I've got today. Hope you all enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Growth Mentor Summit.